On the evening of June the 9th, 1972, Don Barnett was standing beside Rapid Creek when he saw a small car being tossed about in the water, disappearing beneath the surface before coming back up again and smashing into an old wooden bridge. As he watched, the bridge began to break apart under the force of the water, before eventually collapsing and being swept away. One of the men standing beside him turned and said, "My goodness, Don, somebody could get killed in this thing." What neither man knew was that Rapid Creek was still rising, and before the night was over, more than 50,000 cubic feet of water, almost 380,000 gallons, would be tearing through Rapid City every second. And little did he know just how many somebodies there would be. Rapid City lies on the eastern edge of the Black Hills in South Dakota, where the forested slopes of the hills eventually give way to the much flatter Great Plains. By 1972, around 43,000 people lived there, and running straight through the city was the waterway which had given it its name, Rapid Creek. For most of the year there was nothing particularly threatening about it. It wound down from the Black Hills on the western side of Rapid City, and then continued east through residential neighborhoods. Over the years, however, the city had gradually grown around it, with hundreds of homes eventually built across its natural floodplain. Canyon Lake had been part of Rapid City for decades. After an earlier dam was destroyed by flooding in 1907, the lake was recreated as a Works Progress Administration project in the 1930s and became a popular recreational spot for local families. By Friday, June the 9th, several days of rain had already left parts of the Black Hills saturated. The day itself was warm and humid, and as thunderstorms developed over the hills, unusually weak winds meant that they barely moved, repeatedly dumping rain over the same area. By late afternoon, it had become relentless. Near Nemo and Sheridan Lake, almost 15 inches would eventually fall in around 6 hours, while across an area of roughly 60 square miles, the average was around 10 inches. The problem wasn't simply how much rain was falling, but where it was falling. The Black Hills are cut by steep slopes, narrow valleys and canyons, which channel water downhill. Small streams feed larger ones, many of which eventually find their way into Rapid Creek. And as the rain continued that afternoon, water began pouring out of the hills faster than those streams could carry it away. By early evening, roads were beginning to flood, communications with some of the more isolated areas were becoming difficult, and waterways which were normally little more than a trickle were beginning to rise. At 7:15 that evening, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for parts of the northern Black Hills. As further reports came in and conditions continued to deteriorate, the warning was extended at around 8 o'clock to include Rapid Creek, and Rapid City's Emergency Operations Center was activated. It was difficult, however, to judge just how serious conditions were becoming, with radar information from nearby Ellsworth Air Force Base unreliable and intermittent that night. Rapid City also had 4 outdoor civil defense sirens, although none of them would be sounded. Warnings instead travelled through radio and television broadcasts, telephone calls and emergency workers. For most people living further downstream, it was just a wet and miserable Friday evening, rather than the beginning of a catastrophe. Among them were Ron and Levon Masters and their 5 children, Stephen, Jonathan, Joanne, Karen, and their youngest 2-year-old Timothy. The family heard warnings of possible flooding along Rapid Creek, but like thousands of others in the city, they had no way of seeing what was happening miles away in the darkness of the Black Hills. Meanwhile, further into the Black Hills, the situation was getting worse by the minute. Every stream feeding Rapid Creek was adding to the volume, and with every mile the water travelled towards Rapid City, it gathered more. Trees and branches were being torn loose, fencing and other debris were being swept into the current, while roads which had been passable earlier in the evening were beginning to disappear beneath the water. By around 9:15, the change in Rapid Creek was becoming frighteningly obvious. Above Canyon Lake, its level would rise by around 12 feet in little more than 2 hours, while at some locations during the flood, the water rose 3.5 feet in just 15 minutes. National Guard Captain James Whitehead had spent the day training and was eating supper at a drive-in when word came over the radio that guardsmen were being called to duty. He was sent west from Rapid City to find out how bad conditions had become, but the water soon made it impossible for him to continue. Nearby, he spotted an older couple stranded in floodwater, which had already reached their chests, and helped them climb into a tree. Whitehead then decided that he had better find a tree himself. It was dark, the rain was still falling, and the noise of the water was becoming almost overwhelming. Then something enormous struck the tree he was clinging to. It was a house. The force of the impact was enough for Whitehead to feel some of the roots beneath him beginning to break, and as he held on, occasional flashes of lightning gave him brief glimpses of what was now moving through the darkness below. Houses, vehicles, and propane tanks were being carried along by the current. What Whitehead was seeing was part of a flood crest, which over the course of around 3.5 hours would travel some 22 miles through the Black Hills and into Rapid City, gathering more water and debris as it went. And directly in its path was Canyon Lake. By the time the floodwater reached the lake, it was carrying a huge amount of debris with it. The spillway gates were opened in an attempt to lower the rapidly rising lake. Then a large boat dock broke free from the lake shore and became lodged across the spillway, trapping even more debris behind it. There was little anyone could do to clear it. The lake continued to rise until, at around 10 o'clock that night, water began pouring over the top of the dam. Because the dam was an earth embankment, water began eroding the downstream face and weakening the structure. But by the time the lake began overflowing, the disaster was already well underway. Most of the enormous volume of water coming towards Rapid City had never been stored behind the dam at all. It had poured into Rapid Creek from the surrounding hills and tributaries, much of it from rainfall which had fallen downstream of the much larger Pactola Dam further into the Black Hills. In fact, even before Canyon Lake Dam failed, the flow entering the lake had already reached 12 times the previous record measured there. Canyon Lake was being overwhelmed by the flood rather than creating it. It was at around this point that Don Barnett found himself on the western side of Rapid City. Barnett was just 29 years old and had been mayor for little more than a year. As he travelled around trying to understand what was happening, he stopped near an old wooden bridge above Canyon Lake, where a crew from the local gas company was desperately trying to shut off a gas line attached to it. Barnett joined them, and within seconds of stepping from his vehicle, he was soaked from head to foot. Then they saw the small car. The men could only hope there was nobody inside. Minutes later came the sound of timber breaking, and the bridge itself collapsed into Canyon Lake. Barnett had seen enough. He went looking for a telephone so that he could get a warning out. At around 10:40 that night, Barnett's warning was broadcast across local radio and television, urging anyone living beside Rapid Creek to leave immediately for higher ground. He warned that conditions were going to get much worse before they got better, but by then floodwater was already reaching some homes. Ron and Levon Masters had decided that their family needed to leave. Water was coming into the lower part of their house, and with 5 children to get to safety, Ron chose their International Scout rather than the family car, because the 4-wheel drive vehicle sat higher from the ground. Stephen, Jonathan, Joanne, Karen, and little Timothy climbed in with their parents, and the family set off through the rain. They came desperately close to making it. As they attempted to cross near Rapid Creek, another surge of water came through, caught the Scout, and swept the vehicle sideways, forcing it against several trees. The trees prevented it from being carried away, but the water continued to rise around them and began filling the Scout, trapping the family inside. Lavon remembered reaching the point where her nose was almost against the ceiling, and with no obvious way out, they began telling one another how much they loved each other. They believed they were going to die there. Their son Stephen told his father that everything was in God's hands, and those were the last words Ron would ever hear him say. Then Ron began to act. He kicked at a window on the opposite side of the vehicle until he managed to break his way through. Once outside, he reached back in and pulled Lavon through, then turned his attention to 14-year-old Karen. Karen had been holding her 2-year-old brother, Timothy. As Ron pulled her from the vehicle and into the torrent, the current tore the little boy from her grasp. Timothy disappeared into the darkness. Before they had any chance of reaching him, the water rose over the Scout, leaving Stephen, Jonathan, and 8-year-old Joanne still trapped inside. Ron, Lavon, and Karen were now outside the vehicle, but they were far from safe. Somehow they reached nearby trees, where they would spend the next several hours surrounded by a torrent filled with pieces of the city. Ron held on to Lavon with one arm, while she clung to a branch. More than once during the night she told him to let her go, but he refused, and they remained there without knowing what had happened to any of the children they could no longer see. At almost the same time, another man was fighting for his life in the lake. Dave Baumberger had gone with his father and a family friend to move belongings from his father's low-lying home as the water rose. When they tried to leave, they found their escape already cut off and took refuge with several neighbours in the highest house nearby. It didn't remain safe for long. The water rose through the house in sudden surges, eventually lifting it from its foundation. Everyone climbed into the attic, but as the building began breaking apart, the roof split open and Baumberger was thrown into the flood. He managed to catch a tree near the lakeshore, only to watch another tree beside him topple into the water. When a large inner tube floated past, he jumped for it and missed. Baumberger was now in Canyon Lake, struggling towards the shore, and estimated that he was only 20 or 25 feet away when the behaviour of the water suddenly changed. At around 10:45, after being overtopped for roughly 45 minutes, Canyon Lake Dam breached. Baumberger felt the lake begin rushing away beneath him. He was pulled towards the opening, swept through the area of the dam, and then carried downstream, bouncing against debris as the water took him for roughly a mile through Rapid City. By now, electrical power was failing, and most of what happened next took place in almost complete darkness. People could hear the water long before they could make sense of what was in it. Survivors compared the noise to a freight train, mixed with the sound of breaking timber, exploding propane tanks, and people shouting for help. Occasional flashes of lightning offered only brief glimpses of what was passing by. Just west of downtown, 6 teenagers found themselves caught by the rapidly rising flood near the Rushmore building. One of them managed to run towards a fire escape, but for the others the situation changed in seconds. Water which had been round their feet was suddenly at their knees and moving too quickly to walk through. As they searched for anything they could climb onto, the back wall of a nearby building gave way. Ed Healy and Gail Nemetti were swept away and would later be found dead. 3 of the boys managed to cling to the back of a car as the water rose over its roof, but eventually the force of it was drowning them where they held on. Realizing they could stay there no longer, they looked at one another, said they hoped they would see each other the following day, and let go. 2 of them would survive, but Randy Shacklet would not. Elsewhere across Rapid City, there were extraordinary scenes of survival. Arlene Mattis, her husband, and 2 relatives were swept away after their vehicle began to float, eventually finding themselves being carried downstream on pieces of rooftop and wreckage before becoming lodged amongst trees. At A&B Welding Supply, Denny Bowles and several others had been forced onto a display counter as floodwater filled the building. From there they watched 2-story houses floating past in the darkness, some with people still inside shining flashlights from the upstairs windows. National Guard soldiers moved along the creek, firing flares into the sky, briefly illuminating the flooded city in an orange glow. But for many of those stranded in the darkness, there was simply no way for the rescuers to reach them. Robbie Corner had been out with friends earlier that evening, looking at the developing flood, when he returned to his mother's home on the western edge of Rapid City and found fast-moving water already surrounding it. He and his friends stood nearby trying to decide whether they could somehow get across. Then houses began floating past. People were clinging to rooftops and screaming for help, while propane tanks struck trees and exploded in the water. The roar was so loud that Robbie and his friends had to shout just to hear one another. His mother was somewhere on the other side. Robbie wanted to remain nearby, hoping that somebody might reach her, but National Guard soldiers eventually forced the teenagers away from the water and took them to a house on higher ground. He spent the night there without knowing whether his mother was alive. By midnight, Rapid Creek was carrying around 50,600 cubic feet of water every second through the city. 15 of the 23 bridges across the creek would eventually be destroyed, while thousands of vehicles were swept away, buried beneath debris or smashed against buildings and trees. The flood was not confined to Rapid City either. At Keystone, the small tourist community close to Mount Rushmore, water tore through the town and at least 8 people lost their lives, while other destructive floods were occurring along Battle Creek, Spring Creek, and Box Elder Creek. Back in Rapid City, however, the night seemed endless. 14-year-old Matthew Van Der Beek had been swept into the flood with his family. His parents and brother did not survive, but Matthew somehow managed to reach the upper branches of a tree. He remained there alone, soaked and shivering, until rescuers eventually found him. He would be the only member of his immediate family to come home. Beside Rapid Creek, Ron and Lavon Masters still had no idea what had happened to their children. Inside the submerged Scout, however, 8-year-old Joanne was still alive, breathing from a small pocket of air near the roof. For a while she could speak to Stephen and Jonathan, who were trapped alongside her, until eventually both boys stopped answering. Hours later, as the water began to recede, Ron heard something beneath him. A voice. He called out, and Joanne answered from inside the vehicle. Somehow she had survived the night trapped beside her 2 brothers. Timothy's body was eventually found caught in a tree several miles downstream, identified by the small Minnesota Twins jacket Lavon had put on him before they left home. Of their 5 children, Karen and Joanne had survived. Stephen, Jonathan, and Timothy had not. As the thunderstorms finally weakened and moved eastwards, the enormous volume of water which had poured from the Black Hills began to subside. By around 5 o'clock on Saturday morning, Rapid Creek was largely back within its banks. For Robbie Corner, daylight meant he could finally go and see what remained of his mother's home, only to find that it had been torn apart so completely that he could see scarcely a single board left where it had once stood. For several more hours he still didn't know what had happened to his mother, until word finally reached him that her body had been found several miles downstream. All across Rapid City, other families were beginning the same search. As people emerged from wherever they had managed to survive the night, they walked into streets buried beneath mud and wreckage, past overturned vehicles, shattered bridges, and empty foundations where houses had stood only hours earlier. Some were looking for relatives. Others were waiting for relatives to come looking for them. And as the searches continued, the number of people who would never be coming home began to rise. By the end of the search, 238 people had lost their lives, with more than 3,000 others injured. The physical destruction was enormous. Some 1,335 homes had been completely destroyed. Around 5,000 vehicles were lost, and 50 businesses had been wiped out, while damage across the area ran into hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. But Rapid City was also facing a problem nobody had ever imagined having to deal with on such a scale: caring for and identifying the dead. At the time, Rapid City had 3 funeral homes, which between them would normally handle around 300 funerals during an entire year. Now, from the events of a single night, there were 238 people to recover, identify and return to their families. There were initially just 11 licensed funeral directors in the city, although eventually around 55 arrived from across the region to help. Even then, there wasn't enough room. At one funeral home, sheeting and blankets had to be laid across the floor, while local dentists provided records to help identify those who could no longer be recognized by sight. With so many families grieving at once, even funerals had to be carefully staggered throughout the next week. Attention soon turned to how a single night of rain had been able to cause such an enormous loss of life. Canyon Lake Dam came under scrutiny, but the evidence confirmed what the events of that night had already shown. Its failure had added to a flood which was already devastating Rapid City. Questions also remained over the warnings. Information had been broadcast during the evening, and emergency workers had tried to evacuate people along the creek, but the sirens had never sounded. For some of those living closest to the water, the first unmistakable warning was the flood arriving at their homes. There was, however, another problem which had been developing for decades. Rapid City had grown towards the creek. Houses, businesses and mobile home parks had been allowed to spread across its natural floodplain, putting thousands of people directly in the path of any exceptional flood. Nobody could prevent another enormous storm from forming over the Black Hills, nor could they stop the water from finding its way into Rapid Creek. What they could change was what stood in its way. Only 2 days after the disaster, city leaders gathered in a small room at the courthouse to discuss what happened next. Federal assistance was available to repair hundreds of mobile home sites which had been damaged beside the creek, restoring water, electricity and sewer lines so that families could eventually return. Rapid City's Public Works Director, Leonard Swanson, wanted none of it. He had worked for the city since 1947 and argued that allowing people to move back onto the same floodplain would simply place them in danger all over again. He told the council that they should never sentence survivors to spend one more night on the suicidal floodplain. Then he broke down in tears. The council agreed. Rather than simply rebuilding Rapid City exactly as it had been before June the 9th, the city began buying residential property along the creek and relocating the people who had lived there. Eventually, around 754 acres were designated as floodway, while land which had once contained homes and mobile home parks became open space, playing fields, walking and cycling trails, and recreational areas. Canyon Lake was rebuilt, with work completed in 1976, but its new spillway was designed differently so that floating debris would be less likely to block the outlet in the way it had on the night of the flood. Flood monitoring and warning systems were also improved, although everyone understood that Rapid Creek would one day rise again. More than half a century later, the difference can still be seen along its banks. Much of the ground which once contained houses and mobile homes is now part of a long green corridor through the city. Perhaps the most important thing about that land, however, is what is no longer there. The homes which once crowded close to Rapid Creek were never allowed to return. For families such as Ron and Levon Masters, nothing Rapid City did afterwards could replace what had been taken from them on the night of June the 9th, 1972. But the city could make sure that when the water rises again, much of the ground where so many families once lived will finally be left for the creek. Now, in my opinion, I think this story is a clear example of how poor planning can lead to the building of houses where nature never intended them to be. And in fact, there are a few cases of this in the UK too. Our condolences go out to the families and friends of all of those who lost their lives, and our best wishes to everyone else who was affected by this tragedy. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.